It is 1938, in a quiet corner of America. Behind the neat fences and clipped hedges of a respectable neighborhood, 4 daughters were being raised in secrecy and silence. Their lives appeared disciplined, almost enviable to the outside world, yet behind closed doors they endured a form of control so extreme that decades later psychiatrists would still struggle to describe it. From the moment of their birth they were not simply children, but subjects, each gesture observed, each error punished, and each breath recorded under the doctrine of a father whose obsessions fused racial ideology with a private crusade for perfection. It is in their household that we begin, not with an explosion of violence or crime, but with the slow tightening of a grip that would eventually leave scars far deeper than any wound. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The Morlok family had long presented itself as a model of propriety. Neighbors remembered the father, Carl, as stiffly courteous, his shirts pressed and his hair carefully parted. His wife, Sadie, walked behind him in public with the quiet reserve expected of a dutiful partner. The 4 daughters, Helen, Edna, Wilma, and Sarah, were rarely seen playing with other children. Instead, they were shepherded together, identical in dress, their movements so synchronized that onlookers described them as more performance than childhood. The year of their birth, 1938, lent them a certain fascination. Quadruplets were a rarity, an oddity that communities often treated as a sign of providence or medical curiosity. Photographers appeared at their door, newspapers wrote small features, and for a brief time their existence was celebrated as a local wonder. Yet the attention only strengthened Carl's resolve to seal them off from what he believed was a corrupt and decaying world. He spoke often, though rarely outside the home, of contamination of ideas, of blood, of morals. The daughters, he insisted, must be preserved, protected, and cultivated like specimens. It was not love that dictated his parenting, but a relentless doctrine of racial and genetic purity, an ideology he would later speak of openly when questioned by investigators. Within the home, this belief translated into constant surveillance. Journals were kept not only by the children, but by their father, who noted their expressions, their mistakes, their progress in obedience. Sadie, the mother, seemed both present and absent in these early years. Relatives later recalled how she moved mechanically, her speech clipped as though she had already resigned herself to a role of endurance. Her attempts to soften Carl's rigid methods were subtle, an extra spoonful of sugar, a whispered reassurance when no one was looking, but they did little to change the course of the family's daily life. By the mid-1940s, the Morlok daughters had become both spectacle and secret. To outsiders, their matching dresses and coordinated manners appeared charming. They performed songs together, recited poems in unison, and smiled when prompted. Yet behind this veneer of harmony was a silence that unsettled even casual visitors. The girls rarely spoke unless asked a direct question, and when they did, their answers were oddly uniform, as though rehearsed. One neighbor later recalled an incident at church in which all 4 bowed their heads and folded their hands at the exact same angle, rising and sitting as though one body. It was eerie, she said, like they weren't children at all but some kind of mirrored image. The father explained this away as discipline, a household that valued order over chaos, and in an era when patriarchal authority was rarely questioned, few pressed further. But within the household walls, the reality was darker. Carl's fixation on control extended into the realm of medicine and pseudoscience. He read voraciously, textbooks on genetics, pamphlets on eugenics, translated tracts smuggled from Germany. He spoke of degeneration, of the need to prove that his daughters were not tainted by weakness. Under the guise of education, he submitted them to nightly lessons in which they were examined, measured, and compared. Their failures were met not with correction but with humiliation, reminders that their worth lay in obedience and conformity. The journals of the daughters, discovered years later, give a chilling glimpse of this period. Helen wrote of the watchers, unseen presences she felt hovering in corners. Edna questioned whether objects changed shape when she turned her head. Wilma's entries were filled with dread about the judges, who she believed would punish her for any mistake. Even Sarah, the most resilient, wrote of constant vigilance, as if her father's eyes had become implanted within her own mind. The wider community saw little of this. Carl maintained his reputation as a stern but respectable man, his family presented as an image of order, amid the uncertainties of the 1940s, when war news spread and rumors of atrocities in Europe reached American towns. He dismissed them as propaganda. In truth, he was quietly sympathetic, admiring policies he claimed brought strength and purity to nations. For the daughters, Adolescence brought no expansion of freedom. Suitors were dismissed, friendships forbidden, education confined to what Carl deemed acceptable. The home became a sealed laboratory in which 4 young women were expected to develop without influence from the outside world. Yet this very isolation, meant to preserve, instead fractured their mind. Their journals reveal a growing inability to distinguish reality from delusion, companionship from coercion, love from surveillance. By 1950, the family had already drawn quiet suspicion from certain quarters. Teachers who briefly interacted with the girls noted their strange A visiting physician questioned their thinness and nervous habits, but Carl was skilled in presenting explanations: delicate constitutions, a strict diet, a home that valued discipline. His professional demeanor, always logical, always composed, deflected concern. Authorities hesitated to press further, unwilling to intrude on what appeared to be a private if unconventional household. The truth, of course, was that the abuse had already calcified into something systematic. What began as paternal authority had evolved into a form of captivity. The daughters, though technically free to move about, lived under surveillance so constant that freedom became meaningless. Their thoughts, their fears, even their imaginations were colonized by the doctrines imposed upon. Looking back, scholars would later describe this first phase, the years between their birth in 1938 and their adolescence in the late 1940s, as the period of enclosure. It was during these years that the groundwork of their psychological collapse was laid. Yet at the time, few could have imagined that the 4 smiling girls in matching dresses were already casualties of an experiment that had no name. The unease remained hidden beneath layers of performance. The girls performed their unity, Carl performed his respectability, Sadie performed her endurance. Only in fragments jotted in a margin, whispered to one another in darkness, did the daughters express what they truly felt: fear, confusion, the sense of being observed even when alone. It is here, at the threshold of their adolescence, that the story begins to bend toward exposure. What had been concealed would soon be revealed, not by confession, but by collapse. And when the walls of the Morlok household finally cracked, what emerged shocked not only a community but an entire field of psychiatry. The 1950s had arrived, and with them a growing unease in the Morlok household. The daughters, now teenagers, could no longer be disguised as the docile curiosities they once appeared. Their bodies were changing, their thoughts branching in ways Carl could neither anticipate nor control. He responded to this shift not with allowance, but with redoubled discipline, increasing his scrutiny until the girls themselves began to fracture under its weight. It was during these years that their private writings became more elaborate, more desperate. Helen's notebooks reveal a mind both imaginative and tormented. She described her father's constant gaze not merely as surveillance, but as an infection, something that seeped into her bloodstream and reappeared as figures at the corners of her vision. She called them the Watchers, beings neither wholly human nor entirely unreal, who followed her steps and corrected her posture in silence. At times she wrote of wanting them destroyed, the house consumed by fire, her father's voice obliterated. At other times she begged forgiveness for entertaining such thoughts, branding herself monstrous for even considering rebellion. Edna's writing took a different turn. She became convinced that objects shifted when her eyes turned away, chairs bending subtly, shadows exchanging places, faces rearranging into strangers only to return when confronted. She developed theories of duplicate worlds, parallel realities, where versions of herself lived freer or more corrupted lives. In these pages, one can trace the early outlines of what psychiatrists would later diagnose as a full detachment from consensual reality. Wilma's focus was narrower, but no less disturbing. She obsessed over performance, the perfection of every task, the avoidance of errors. To fail, she believed, was to invoke punishment not only from her father, but from a faceless tribunal she called the judge. These unseen figures governed her every action, until daily life became a trial she could never win. The more she feared mistakes, the more mistakes multiplied, trapping her in a cycle of anxiety that sometimes left her frozen, unable to speak or move for hours. Sarah, though more stable, carried her own burdens. Her journals reveal an effort to maintain cohesion among the sisters, to soothe their outbursts, to interpret their visions as symbols rather than reality. Yet beneath her apparent resilience lay the same hypervigilance, the same internalization of her father's watchful eye. It was inevitable that cracks would appear to outsiders. Teachers noticed inconsistencies, sharp intellect paired with blank stares, moments of brilliance followed by inexplicable silence. Doctors observed faint scars on wrists, malnourishment that did not fit Carl's explanations of delicate health. A neighbor once overheard raised voices, Carl's booming insistence on purity, Sadie's trembling pleas, the girls weeping in chorus. But when questioned, Carl's composure never faltered. He spoke of protecting his daughters from dangerous influences, of shielding them from a world eager to exploit them. In an era when fathers were still regarded as sovereigns of the household, few dared to challenge him directly. The facade began to falter only when law enforcement was drawn in by accident. A relative, concerned by the family's increasing isolation, attempted to intervene. What began as a quiet welfare check quickly escalated into an interrogation that peeled back layers of secrecy. Carl's responses stunned investigators. Rather than deny or conceal his methods, he elaborated upon them. He spoke of an international conspiracy, a cabal of Jewish psychiatrists, communist sympathizers, and racial degenerates. Their aim, he insisted, was nothing less than the corruption of American youth and the destruction of white racial purity. His daughters, he claimed, had been marked by fame and targeted for moral ruin. Only his vigilance, his surveillance, his examinations, stood between them and annihilation. What investigators expected to be a case of overbearing parenting revealed itself as something more dangerous: the systematic application of fascist ideology within the walls of an American home. Carl praised Hitler's programs against the mentally ill, openly advocating similar measures for America. He insisted that his daughters were not victims, but participants in research, essential to the preservation of civilization. He called their fear discipline, their suffering necessity. He showed no remorse, no flicker of recognition, that his daughters were individuals with needs beyond his doctrine. Sadie, questioned separately, broke her silence. She recounted years of psychological and physical abuse, endured in the name of protecting her daughters from work. She described Carl's escalating obsession, his violent retribution for any suggestion that his methods were harmful. She admitted that she had sought help before, tentatively, but had been Carl's respectable image, his pressed shirts, his articulate speech, his insistence on order, outweighed her quiet warnings. Her testimony was the first time authorities glimpsed the systematic nature of the abuse. She confessed to living in constant fear, threatened into silence, convinced that any attempt to shield her daughters would only intensify their torment. When the girls themselves were finally separated from their father's presence and interviewed, the impact of his domination became unmistakable. Their speech was hesitant, contradictory, as though reality itself had become unreliable. Investigators recorded signs of dissociation, hypervigilance, and a shared system of delusions, so entrenched that the girls could not fully comprehend that their father's surveillance was not normal. Dr. Collins, one of the psychiatrists called in, would later remark that the sisters displayed what modern terminology would classify as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. They suffered not from a single incident of violence, but from a prolonged captivity of the mind, in which their father's gaze had become fused with their own sense of self. The decision came swiftly. The girls were removed from their home and placed under psychiatric care. Carl was arrested, charged with abuse, assault and endangerment. The Morlok household, once a fortress of secrecy, collapsed in a matter of hours. The Quadruplets' brief career as performers ended abruptly, replaced by a new identity, the most studied sisters in American psychiatry. The aftermath rippled far beyond the family. Communities questioned how such abuse had gone unchallenged for so long. Institutions scrambled to explain why early signs of distress had been overlooked. Social services, law enforcement and neighbors alike bore the weight of complicity, whether by silence or by trust in appearances. The federal government, through the newly established National Institute of Mental Health, seized upon the case as an unprecedented opportunity. Here were 4 genetically identical individuals, each diagnosed with schizophrenia, raised in the same environment. To researchers, the Morlok daughters appeared as the perfect natural experiment, a chance to resolve the debate over heredity and environment in mental illness. The ethics of using traumatized young women as research subjects were scarcely considered. Science demanded data, and the sisters provided a case so rare, so compelling, that hesitation gave way to ambition. They were soon assigned the pseudonym Genain, drawn from Greek roots meaning dreadful birth or dire gene. The irony of the name, given their suffering, was overlooked. Thus began a new phase of exploitation. Transported to the new Shilmich facility in Bethesda, Maryland, the quadruplets were separated for the first time in their lives. Each was given her own room,
a space intended for healing but haunted by the echo of their father's constant monitoring. The evaluations were exhaustive. Psychological tests, medical examinations, interviews, all documented with clinical precision. The sisters' individual differences became clear. Sarah resilient, Edna stable, yet participatory, Wilma anxious to the point of paralysis, Helen lost in delusion, yet all bore the imprint of their father's control. What the reports minimized or omitted entirely was the role of ideology and abuse. Carl's racial extremism, his surveillance, his systematic breaking of their autonomy, was treated as background noise, not central cause. The focus, instead, was on genes, inheritance, biology. Trauma was relegated to the margins. The Morlok case, now reframed as the Genain Quadruplets, entered psychiatric literature, not as a tragedy of abuse, but as a landmark in the study of schizophrenia. The girls, reduced to symbols of heredity, would spend decades not as survivors but as specimens. The story, however, had only begun to unfold. Their removal from the family home was not the end of captivity, but the start of a new chapter, one in which the language of science would replace the voice of their father, and the gaze of researchers would echo the surveillance from which they had only just escaped.
The transfer of the Morlok sisters to Bethesda in the late 1950s marked not their liberation, but their reclassification. They were no longer Carl's daughters, nor fragile curiosities of a small Midwestern town. They were now, in the eyes of the federal government, an experiment, one that promised answers to questions psychiatry had been struggling to resolve since the 19th century. From the first day at the National Institute of Mental Health, they were catalogued like specimens. Case files were thickened with photographs, 4 identical faces staring blankly at the camera, hair cropped, shoulders hunched, eyes already reflecting exhaustion. Each was assigned not only a pseudonym, but a letter, a code for quick reference in research papers. Their humanity was obscured beneath layers of classification. The sisters themselves responded in divergent ways. Sarah, the most resilient, adapted with guarded cooperation. She learned the routines, spoke carefully to her interviewers, and maintained enough composure to avoid harsher interventions. Wilma's anxiety deepened in this sterile environment. She struggled to eat, to sleep, convinced that every mistake would be judged by unseen authorities. Edna's delusions multiplied, her writings filling pages with maps of parallel worlds and cosmic judges. Helen, once fiery in her rebellion, became increasingly withdrawn, her visions overwhelming her until she could scarcely distinguish waking from dream. The tests were relentless, psychometric batteries administered weekly, inkblot examinations repeated even after results converged. Researchers studied their gait, their speech, their handwriting. Blood was drawn, brain scans ordered, reflexes measured. When results proved inconclusive, methods escalated. At a time when psychiatry still flirted with invasive procedures, the sisters were subjected to electroconvulsive therapy, high-dose antipsychotics, and experimental sedatives. One physician described the girls as a living laboratory, though in private notes he admitted an unease he could not voice in official reports. For every chart filled, for every data point added to the growing archive, the sisters' health declined. Their bodies weakened under chemical regimens, their thoughts blurred by shocks meant to reset their disordered minds. The institution saw pathology where there was, in truth, trauma. And yet the Genain case, as it was now universally called, thrived in psychiatric literature. The 4 sisters were cited in conferences across the Atlantic, their supposed genetic fate offered as proof that schizophrenia was a biological inheritance. That they had been terrorized since childhood was acknowledged, but minimized, often footnoted rather than analyzed. Trauma, researchers argued, could not explain why all 4 developed the same diagnosis. Only heredity could. The sisters' own testimonies, those rare instances when they were allowed to speak freely, tell a different story. Sarah described nightmares in which her father's face blended with the doctor's, their voices interchangeable in their demands. Wilma admitted to fearing not madness itself, but the certainty that she was a failure incapable of perfection. Edna begged interviewers to believe that the walls shifted, that doors rearranged, that she was trapped in a maze designed by unseen architects. Helen oscillated between fiery hatred of her father and catatonic silence, her body immobile for hours, as though retreating into the only privacy she could find. These accounts were recorded, transcribed, filed, and then largely ignored. The emphasis remained on quantifiable data, not lived experience. To the researchers, subjective narratives were distractions, contaminations of the clean hypothesis they sought to prove. The toll on the sisters was devastating. By the mid-1960s, all four had attempted suicide at least once. Their methods varied: overdose, self-inflicted wounds, attempted hangings, but the intent was consistent: escape by any means. Institutional notes reveal that these attempts were documented clinically, with phrases like manipulative gesture or non-lethal intent, erasing the desperation behind them. Relationships among the sisters themselves grew strained. Separated into different wards, they no longer had the daily intimacy that once bound them. Sarah resented Edna's erratic behavior, fearing it would draw harsher scrutiny. Wilma envied Sarah's composure, convinced that her own trembling hands marked her as inferior. Helen, consumed by her hallucinations, withdrew from them all, whispering to shadows rather than siblings. The shared identity that once shielded them fractured into four isolated selves. Their mother, Sadie, was rarely allowed contact. When she visited, she wept openly, but the staff regarded her as complicit, even hysterical, and discouraged frequent interaction. Carl, by contrast, was barred entirely. His letters, fiery Mirestos railing against Jewish conspiracies and communist psychiatrists, were intercepted and filed as exhibits of his unfitness, yet his influence lingered. The sisters often spoke of him as though he still watched, his gaze present even in government hall. The 1970s brought subtle shifts. The era of lobotomies had passed. The brutality of unchecked electroshock waned. Psychopharmacology, however, ascended. The Morlok sisters were placed on high doses of chlorpromazine and haloperidol, their bodies stiffening under the weight of side effects: tremors, drooling, involuntary muscle spasms, documented clinically as manageable extrapyramidal symptoms. Their voices slowed, their creativity dulled, their journals filled with repetitions rather than revelation. Despite this deterioration, the case remained a jewel in psychiatric literature. Papers continued to cite them as evidence of genetic determinism, their humanity eclipsed by their utility as proof. But there were dissenters. A handful of researchers, women, often younger, often marginalized within the hierarchy, argued that the Morlok story revealed something else: the devastating effects of authoritarian abuse and institutional neglect. They pointed out that the sisters' so-called schizophrenic symptoms echoed classic trauma responses: hypervigilance, dissociation, intrusive visions. Their warnings, however, were buried under the prestige of the Genain Project. The sisters aged within the institution's shadow. By the 1980s, they were middle-aged women, their lives defined almost entirely by psychiatrists' notes. Sarah married briefly, an attempt at ordinary life, but the union dissolved quickly, eroded by mistrust and illness. Wilma lived in constant fear of relapse, cycling through group homes that treated her less as a person than as a permanent patient. Edna spent stretches in locked wards, her delusions deepening, her handwriting devolving into illegible scrawl. Helen, once the most rebellious, succumbed to near-total withdrawal, her body present but her spirit distant. They were studied into old age, their files expanding into tens of thousands of pages. Generations of psychiatrists built careers on their suffering, dissertations and textbooks, citing them as a definitive case. The sisters themselves were granted no such legacy. Their story, reframed as science, was removed from their voices entirely. To read the records now is to feel a chill beyond empathy. One is confronted with the realization that the Morlok sisters escaped one prison, only to be bound within another, traded from the ideology of a fascist father to the cold apparatus of a scientific institution. Each spoke of wanting freedom, yet freedom never arrived. They became immortalized not as survivors but as subjects, their lives dissected until little of their humanity remained. Even in death, their case did not end. Some records remained sealed, others scattered in archives across Maryland. Researchers still cite the Genain Quadruplets in genetic studies, often with little acknowledgement of the conditions that shaped their suffering. To science, they remain a symbol of heredity. To history, they are a warning of what happens when ideology and ambition eclipse compassion. By the close of the 20th century, the sisters were elderly, scattered in care homes, their names nearly forgotten beyond the walls of psychiatry. They had been famous once as performers in childhood, then infamous as patients in adulthood. But as time eroded memory, their story dissolved into obscurity, mentioned only in specialized literature. The tragedy, however, lingers, not merely because of what was done to them, but because of how their pain was transmuted into data, their humanity into evidence. They were, in truth, among the most studied women in psychiatric history. Yet for all the observation, the note-taking, the analysis, the essential fact was lost: that four sisters had been born into a household of terror, raised under the gaze of a tyrant,
and then consumed by a system more interested in proving theories than in offering mercy. The Morlok sisters did not simply suffer schizophrenia, they suffered the weight of history itself. By the dawn of the 1990s, the Morlok sisters were no longer the celebrated subjects of research papers, but middle-aged women, whose bodies bore the scars of decades of intervention. Their case files, however, continued to circulate in academic halls, cited by scientists who had never met them, discussed in seminars where their humanity was reduced to charts and diagnoses. Sarah, the most resilient, had fought tirelessly for fragments of normalcy. She worked modest jobs when her health allowed, lived in small apartments or care homes, and tried to keep some contact with her sisters, but her journals betray a haunting resignation. She wrote that she often felt like an exhibit set aside in a museum basement, catalogued but forgot. Her words carried none of the fiery desperation of her youth, only a muted sorrow. Wilma's life unfolded under the constant shadow of fear. Her obsessive need for perfection, honed in childhood under her father's tyranny, transformed into a rigid compliance with medical staff and caretakers. She rarely challenged authority, terrified of punishment or judgment. Friends described her as kind, even gentle, but perpetually anxious, forever anticipating some hidden tribunal that never appeared. Edna's condition worsened. By middle age she lived in near constant delusion. She believed staff were doubles, her sisters imposters, the very corridors rearranging each night into new geometries. For long periods, she required locked ward. Staff recorded her ramblings with clinical detachment, yet within her pages of fragmented words lay the echo of her father's endless surveillance, paranoia repurposed into architecture, suspicion embedded in the very walls around her. Helen, once the boldest, had by this time withdrawn almost entirely. Long stretches passed when she refused to speak at all, communicating only through gestures or silence. Catatonia became her refuge. Medical notes list her as low-functioning, yet one cannot help but see her muteness as the final rebellion, a refusal to be interpreted, a denial of the gaze that had consumed her life. Karl Morlok himself had died decades earlier, unrepentant to the end. He left behind writings filled with the same conspiracy-laden rhetoric that had poisoned his household, papers railing against degenerates and praising the sterilization policies of Nazi Germany. To his death he maintained that he had been the victim of persecution, that his family's collapse was the work of enemies, rather than the natural consequence of his cruelty. Sadie, long freed from Karl's grip but scarred by years of silence, died with little recognition. Her daughters rarely spoke of her, perhaps because memories of her were entwined with helplessness, with the failure to protect. She too had been a victim of Karl's tyranny, but her passivity in the face of it left wounds her daughters could never reconcile. The story of the Morlok sisters, rebranded in scientific literature as the Genain Quadruplets, remained both a triumph and a tragedy in psychiatric circles. To many scientists, they represented the strongest evidence yet for the heritability of schizophrenia. Countless papers used their case as a cornerstone of genetic research, yet as late as the 2000s, debates still raged over whether their condition had been inherited or forged in the crucible of abuse. For those who look beyond the medical reports, the moral of the story is clearer. The sisters' schizophrenia cannot be disentangled from the violence of their upbringing. Karl's surveillance, his ideological obsessions, his relentless control fractured their minds long before they reached adolescence. That trauma alone could explain their suffering. That all four developed schizophrenia does not, as some scientists insisted, prove inheritance. It proves only that four lives subjected to identical brutality may break in identical ways. But this truth rarely found its way into textbooks. Instead, the sisters became abstractions. Case Study 2068, the Genain Quadruplets, cited without context, their human suffering footnoted or erased. Their journals, where they begged to be heard, remained locked in archives. Their voices were overshadowed by charts and statistics. In their final years, the sisters lived quietly, scattered across care facilities in the Midwest. Occasionally a journalist or historian rediscovered their story, writing pieces tinged with shock that such a case had existed at all, but for the most part, they faded from public memory. Their legacy endures, though not in the way they deserved. For psychiatry, they remain a case study. For historians of medicine, they are a cautionary tale of how scientific ambition can eclipse compassion. And for anyone willing to read between the lines, their story is a haunting example of how ideology, abuse and neglect can intertwine to ruin not only a family but generations of understanding. When one studies the Morlok sisters today, it is impossible to avoid the question, what might their lives have been if they had been allowed freedom? If Karl's tyranny had been interrupted earlier, If their trauma had been recognized rather than pathologized, if compassion had guided science instead of ambition, would they have found peace? Would they have been able to live ordinary lives, to marry, to raise children, to grow old without the weight of thousands of eyes upon them? We cannot know. What we do know is that they were denied they were denied it first by a father who saw them as extensions of his ideology, and later by a medical system that saw them as instruments of knowledge rather than human beings. Their story lingers because it reveals something larger than a single family's tragedy. It reveals how easily cruelty can masquerade as discipline, how easily science can mirror tyranny when stripped of empathy. It reveals too how fragile the line is between observation and exploitation, between study and violation. The Morlok sisters lived and died as some of the most studied women in history, yet they remain to this day some of the least heard. What do you think? Were the Morlok sisters victims of genetics or of their father's tyranny? Should they be remembered as patients or as survivors of one of the darkest family histories in American psychiatry? Like, subscribe, and share if you want more stories from the shadows of history.
The summer of 1952 marked the official end of the Morlok family's fragile facade and the beginning of their second captivity. When federal marshals escorted the four sisters to Bethesda, Maryland, it was not to liberate them, but to deliver them into a new system of surveillance. The National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, still in its infancy, had decided the quadruplets were a gift too rare to ignore. Unlike the crude supervision of their father, the ward where they were housed gleamed with modern authority. The walls were sterile white, the halls polished, the air scented faintly with disinfectant. It was, on the surface, the opposite of their childhood home. Yet to the sisters it must have felt eerily familiar. Locked doors, watchful eyes, the unshakable sense that they were always being observed. Each was given a private room, an unprecedented luxury compared to their shared attic quarters. But even solitude came at a price. Two-way mirrors allowed staff to watch them, clipboards in hand. Microphones caught their whispers. Every interaction, every slip of the tongue, every trembling gesture became data. For the first time in their lives, the quadruplets were separated not only from their parents but from each other. The separation, researchers believed, was crucial. Without their father's orchestrated delusions binding them together, perhaps the sisters' individual psychologies would reveal themselves more clearly. What the scientists failed to consider was that this rupture was itself a fresh trauma. For girls who had endured isolation from the outside world, to now be isolated even from one another was a second shattering. The initial months of observation were exhaustive. Sarah, the eldest by minutes, adjusted best. She greeted staff politely, attempted conversation, even showed flashes of humor. But her journals from that time reveal how carefully she curated her behavior. "If I perform normal," she wrote, "maybe they will leave me alone." Helen's condition worsened under the sterile glare. Her imaginary companions, once protective, now whispered violently in her ears. She struck walls with her fists until they bled, insisting that the room itself was conspiring against her. Wilma, the perfectionist, responded by following every rule with near-mechanical precision. She made her bed with military corners, answered questions in complete sentences, never once stepping out of line. Yet staff noted her trembling hands, her eyes darting to corners of the room, as though awaiting silent judges. Edna drifted furthest from reality. She told doctors that the mirrors were portals, that when she slept she awakened in another hospital identical in appearance, but subtly wrong. She spoke of doctors with shifting faces, of nurses who were double. Her theories of parallel dimensions, born in her childhood diaries, flourished unchecked. Dr. David Rosenthal, ambitious and sharp-eyed, saw in the sisters the perfect laboratory. He referred to them not as Sarah, Helen, Wilma, and Edna, but as N and Q and S coded initials, stripped of personhood. He insisted this was necessary for objectivity, though his notes reveal a thinly veiled thrill at the spectacle before him. Here, he wrote, "We find the purest natural experiment psychiatry has ever been offered." The irony was cruel. For the sisters, their father had treated them as subjects in his grotesque study of racial purity. Now the scientific establishment repeated the same violation under the guise of progress. The girls were subjected to batteries of tests. Endless Rorschach ink blots, word associations, memory exercises, and intrusive interviews. They were photographed daily. Electroencephalograms mapped their brain waves. Even their menstrual cycles were charted, as though the rhythm of their bodies might reveal the mystery of madness. The sisters responded in ways that reflected their fractured survival strategies. Sarah endured with composure. Helen resisted with violence. Wilma obeyed in silence. Edna retreated into fantastical explanations. Each adaptation was catalogued and measured, yet the deeper truth that these were human responses to lifelong abuse was seldom acknowledged. Staff occasionally noted the echoes of Carl Morlok in the ward. When Helen screamed about the watchers, doctors interpreted it as schizophrenic paranoia, rarely considering that she was reliving her father's surveillance. When Wilma froze in catatonia, after making a minor mistake, researchers chalked it up to psychotic rigidity, ignoring her terror of judgment. Outside the institute, the public had largely forgotten the quadruplets. The brief headlines about their father's arrest had faded, replaced by Cold War anxieties and the Korean conflict. Only within psychiatric journals did their story persist, transformed from tragedy into data. Carl, meanwhile, served less than 2 years in prison. His crimes, framed narrowly as child neglect and physical assault, failed to capture the scale of psychological devastation. Released quietly in 1954, he vanished from public life, though reports later placed him at gatherings of white supremacist groups. That he could disappear while his daughters remained under scrutiny was a bitter testament to the era's blind spots. Sadie, freed at last from her husband but broken by decades of silence, lived in a modest apartment in Lansing. She avoided publicity, rarely visited her daughters, and carried her guilt to the grave in 1967. Staff turnover meant new faces every few months, some kind, some indifferent, some cruelly curious, yet the sisters' world remained narrow. Therapy sessions, observation, meals in silence. Sarah clung to small acts of rebellion. She smuggled scraps of paper to write letters no one would ever read. "I am not your experiment," she scrawled in one. "I am a person," in another. "We are not 4 cases, we are 4 lives." But her voice was rarely heard outside file cabinet. When researchers published their landmark volume, The Genain Quadruplets, a case study in schizophrenia in 1963, the sisters' humanity was buried beneath graphs and theoretical debate. The book stretched over 600 pages, praised for its rigor, yet nowhere did it name Carl Morlok's violence for what it was, the crucible of their suffering. For the scientific community, the sisters had become proof that schizophrenia could be inherited, proof that biology outweighed nurture. Few questioned the ethics of using traumatized women as evidence. Fewer still asked whether their illness was not a genetic inevitability, but the natural consequence of sustained terror. And so the Morlok sisters remained trapped. First by a father's fascism, then by a laboratory's detachment. By the late 1950s, NIMH began releasing them gradually into supervised housing. Sarah adjusted best, eventually marrying a social worker named Robert Carter. She bore 2 sons, both healthy, both free of schizophrenia, an outcome that undermined the very theories her case was supposed to support. Wilma and Edna drifted in and out of institutions, stabilized by new medications, but never free of dependence. Helen remained institutionalized for life, her silence broken only by bursts of haunting artwork, jagged figures, shifting faces, houses that collapsed upon themselves. Together they embodied both the resilience of survival and the devastation of exploitation. The collapse of the Morlok family had birthed a new chapter in psychiatric history, but at what cost? The sisters had been robbed twice. Once by their father's tyranny, once by a system that mistook their suffering for scientific opportunity. And still their voices whispered through journals, through art, through fragments of testimony. By the mid-1960s, the world outside the NIMH campus had changed beyond recognition. The civil rights movement shook the foundations of American society. The Vietnam War filled televisions with images of chaos, and a new counterculture demanded freedom of the body and the mind. Yet inside the quiet halls of the psychiatric wards, time remained frozen. The quadruplets lived in a suspended state, neither free women nor prisoners in the legal sense, but something stranger. Specimens preserved for study. The book The Genain Quadruplets, a case study in schizophrenia, had cemented their legacy. It circulated through medical schools, cited in lectures, used as evidence that schizophrenia was a heritable fate. Their pseudonym, Genain, meaning dire birth in Greek, masked their true surname. Yet the sisters could not escape the weight of its symbolism. They were no longer Sarah, Helen, Wilma and Edna Morlok. They had been christened anew as mythic figures of pathology, stripped of ordinary humanity.
Within the psychiatric community, debates raged. Some argued the sisters proved once and for all that genes dictated madness. Others claimed their fractured lives only demonstrated the power of environment. But in the noise of theory, one fact was consistently neglected. The Morlok household had been a crucible of cruelty, and the sisters' suffering could not be disentangled from their father's obsession. Still, researchers continued to circle back, returning every few years to extract another round of data, blood samples, cognitive batteries, interviews that dredged up the same questions over and over. Do you hear voices? Do you believe others can read your thoughts? Do you feel watched? The very structure of inquiry forced the sisters to relive their father's dominion, confirming diagnoses that had been etched into their charts before they had even turned 8. Sarah, the closest to what psychiatrists called functional, had built a semblance of life with her husband Robert. He was patient, steady, but their marriage existed under constant surveillance. Researchers visited their home, asking Robert to note Sarah's moods, her outbursts, her silences. Even intimacy was a matter of record. Fertility charts, questions about desire, fears of hereditary taint. Her 2 sons grew up shadowed by suspicion. Teachers asked subtle questions about their behavior, and medical students occasionally appeared at the door under the guise of family follow-ups. The boys were normal by every measure, but they bore the mark of their mother's file, children of the Genain stud. Sarah, weary of it all, once confided to a friend, "I traded one prison for another." Wilma, by contrast, lived a more fragile existence. Medicated heavily, she moved between halfway houses and short stints of independence. Though her life never drifted far from institutional orbit, she was meticulous about routines, grocery shopping at the same hour, folding laundry with geometric precision, never deviating from habit. These small structures gave her stability, but to observers they became evidence of compulsive feature. When a new generation of antipsychotics emerged in the 1970s, Wilma was among the first to be tested. The drugs softened her paranoia, but left her body stiff, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "I feel like a mannequin," she once wrote in shaky script. Yet doctors hailed the medication as progress. Edna remained the most enigmatic. Her accounts of alternate dimensions, shadow doubles, and mirrored worlds never ceased. What doctors dismissed as florid delusion, others, years later, would describe as almost literal. She filled notebooks with elaborate maps of invisible geographies, each page marked with spirals and shifting symbols. One staff member secretly kept copies, convinced that her writings resembled outsider art of rare significance. But Edna herself grew lost in these landscapes. She wandered city streets at night, certain she was passing through overlapping realities. Arrests for trespassing and vagrancy punctuated her life, always ending with her return to institutional care. To the public she was invisible, yet to researchers she remained a treasure trove. A chronic schizophrenic, whose creative delusions offered endless material. Helen, the most tragic of all, rarely left the hospital ground. After years of violent outbursts and catatonia, her existence narrowed to silence punctuated by haunting creativity. She painted with intensity, producing canvases of fractured faces, twisting staircases, and figures dissolving into shadow. These works were collected quietly by sympathetic nurses, though never displayed. Only decades later would a few surface in obscure exhibitions of psychiatric art. Helen spoke rarely, but when she did, her words were piercing. "The house is still here," she once murmured to a visiting psychologist. "You built it around us again." The remark, chilling in its simplicity, underscored the reality the institution refused to face. The Morlok sisters were not merely patients, but survivors of a childhood that had been replicated in clinical form. By the 1970s, psychiatry itself was under fire. The anti-psychiatry movement, led by figures like R.D. Laing and Thomas Sesh, accused the profession of pathologizing suffering, of confusing social control with healing. The Genain case became a flashpoint. Was it an unparalleled natural experiment, or a grotesque violation of human dignity? Journalists who attempted to uncover the sisters' real identities were met with sealed records and institutional silence, yet whispers persisted. Some claimed the Morlok sisters had been sterilized to prevent the propagation of illness, though official files denied it. Others suggested that classified military programs had briefly studied them, intrigued by the possibility of mapping schizophrenia for intelligence purposes. Whether true or not, such rumors reflected the aura of secrecy surrounding their life. In 1975, a documentary filmmaker petitioned to feature the sisters in a film on mental health. The request was denied, but the filmmaker later recalled a private viewing of tapes. Grainy black and white reels showing the quadruplets in interview. They looked less like patients than prisoners, he remarked, performing madness for the camera. The existence of those tapes has never been confirmed, yet archivists hint that hours of footage remain locked in federal repository. If released, they would offer not only scientific data, but a haunting chronicle of exploitation. As decades passed, the sisters aged within the shadow of their pseudonym. Their story became case law in psychiatry, taught to students who never knew their name. Each time a young doctor opened the Genain Quadruplets, the Morloks were reborn as abstractions. Their father's brutality receded into footnotes. Their individuality vanished beneath diagnostic codes. Yet even within this silence, faint resistances endure. Sarah's letters, Wilma's routines, Edna's maps, Helen's paintings, all fragments of identity that refused to be erased. By the early 1980s, the psychiatric establishment began quietly stepping away from the case. Genetics research was shifting toward molecular biology, twin studies, and neurochemistry. The Genains were no longer the crown jewel of schizophrenia research. They were aging women, whose lives had been exhausted by scrutiny. But for the sisters themselves, there was no relief. The experiment might have ended on paper, but in practice it had woven itself into every corner of their existence. In this sense, the Morlok tragedy was unique. A family destroyed by a father's ideology, then preserved by science in formality. The world moved on, yet they remained, pinned like butterflies in a collection. Their suffering transformed into academic capital. What remains unanswered is this: were the Morlok sisters truly proof of genetic fate? Or were they simply children who never escaped their father's prison? First physical, then institutional. Is schizophrenia an inherited destiny, or the final scar of lives lived under unrelenting fear? And perhaps most disturbing, when does the pursuit of knowledge become indistinguishable from the violence it claims to study?
By the 1980s, the Morlok sisters were middle-aged women, though in truth they never inhabited adulthood the way others did. They had been children under Carl's tyranny, then subjects under the watchful eyes of psychiatrists. To speak of them as women with choices is misleading. They were always observed, assessed, and arranged according to others' categories. When the case study that had defined them slipped from the center of psychiatric debate, the sisters were left in a strange limbo. They were too well known to be forgotten entirely, yet no longer fashionable enough to justify further rounds of research funding. Younger doctors knew their pseudonym, the Genain Quadruplets, but few bothered to visit them. Their significance had been reduced to a paragraph in textbooks, a case number in psychiatric history. And so while the scientific community drifted elsewhere, the sisters' lives narrowed into quiet, sometimes unbearable repetitions. Sarah, the most adaptive, clung to fragments of normal life. Her marriage endured, though not without strain. The constant reminder that her children might inherit the illness weighed heavily on her. She wrote in a late journal entry, "They watch my boys like wolves, waiting to see if madness will bloom. They forget that fear itself can be inherited." She worked sporadically in clerical jobs, always under the shadow of exhaustion from medication. Even in workplaces, she was sometimes recognized, not as herself, but as one of the four. A nurse once whispered to her in a clinic waiting room, "Are you Jenny?" Sarah turned away, ashamed as if accused of a crime. Wilma lived mostly in supervised housing, her life circumscribed by strict order. Routines became her fragile form of freedom. She kept her closet arranged by color, her shoes lined with military precision, her meals eaten at the same hour each day. To outsiders this appeared as compulsion. To her it was a way to survive without unraveling. She often told staff that her greatest fear was chaos. If something moves out of place, the whole world will fall. These words echoed the discipline of her father's household. Carl's rigid rules, his endless punishments for small mistakes. Wilma had internalized his voice so thoroughly that she lived decades beyond him, still obeying. Edina wandered between realities. Hospitals recorded her as treatment-resistant, a phrase that captured the profession's frustration but not her inner life. She filled notebooks with diagrams of invisible doors and passages, sketches of spiral staircases ascending into voids. She believed the earth itself contained layers, and that she moved between them during sleep. What made her accounts so chilling was not only their strangeness, but their consistency. Year after year, her visions repeated the same architecture of doubles and labyrinths. To staff it was delusion. Yet for anyone reading her writings decades later, the detail carries a different weight, like testimony from someone who lived in a parallel, haunted geography. Her life in the physical world, however, was far less extraordinary. She drifted through cheap apartments and shelters, often vanishing for weeks before police or social workers returned her to institutional care. She rarely recognized herself as ill. For Edina, the doctors and nurses were the imposters, the shadows not. Helen by this time lived almost entirely in silence. Catatonia had settled over her like permanent frost. Yet when she painted, bursts of expression broke through. Her canvases depicted houses with no exits, staircases folding back upon themselves, and windows looking into other windows. Figures were sometimes present, always four identical, their faces blurred as if eroded by time. Her art never left the hospital. A few nurses saved scraps, but most works were discarded as clutter. Decades later, fragments rediscovered in storage would astonish curators of outsider art, though by then Helen had long since faded into obscurity. Occasionally Helen spoke in brief, unsettling phrases. Once she whispered to a doctor, "We were born already observed." The man wrote it down as a sign of paranoia, but it was more than that. It was truth. Meanwhile, the world outside their hospitals and homes had transformed. Genetics had entered a molecular age. The discovery of DNA's structure, the mapping of chromosomes, and the rise of neuroscience meant that the sisters' value as a natural experiment diminished. They were no longer at the cutting edge of psychiatric science. Yet this did not mean they were free. Their names lingered in casebooks, their pseudonym recycled in lectures. Even when not studied directly, they were never allowed to be forgotten. It was a peculiar form of imprisonment, absent from science, but trapped in its archive. The Morlok story also attracted curiosity from beyond psychiatry. In the late 1980s, a handful of journalists attempted to track them down. The sisters lived under assumed surnames in public records, their files sealed, yet leaks always occurred. One reporter claimed to have found Sarah working in a Midwestern office. Another whispered of Helen's artwork, hanging in a locked staff lounge. These stories rarely made it to print. Legal barriers, ethical questions, and fear of lawsuits kept most editors cautious. Still, rumors circulated in medical underground circles that the sisters had been sterilized, that two had undergone experimental neurosurgery, that shadowy agencies had used their case as cover for classified work. None of these rumors could be confirmed, yet their persistence reflected the darkness at the heart of the case. For even in silence, the Morloks carried an aura of secrecy, as if too much had been done to them for the truth ever to be fully known. Their father Carl was by then long dead. His writings, preserved in state archives, revealed a man still obsessed with purity, order, and fear of contamination. To his final days, he saw himself as a martyr. He never recognized his daughters as victims of his hand. Their mother, Sadi, had died quietly, leaving little record. In obituaries she was described only as survived by 4 daughters, though those daughters barely spoke of her. To them she had been a shadow present but powerless. The sisters' later years blurred into obscurity. Each lived in fragile health, reliant on a mix of medications that dulled pain but introduced their own torments. By middle age, all bore the marks of side effects, tremors, brittle bones, dulled expressions. They had been remade by chemicals as much as by trauma. And yet within these muted lives, faint threads of resistance endured. Sarah's letters to her sons, urging them to live freely. Wilma's rigid routines, her way of reclaiming order from chaos. Edina's labyrinthine maps of hidden worlds. Helen's fractured canvas. Each fragment was a refusal, however small, to be entirely consumed by the study that had defined them. By the 1990s, the Morloks had vanished from public sight. No new papers emerged. No researchers came calling. The Genain Quadruplets remained a legend in psychiatric lore, invoked as proof of heredity, yet never revisited in flesh and blood. But silence, as their story shows, is never neutral. It is not freedom, but burial. Their names were hidden, but their lives remained chained to archive. And somewhere, deep in federal repositories and university vaults, the full case remains: thousands of pages, hours of recordings, discarded paintings, sealed medical files. Few have ever seen. Those who have speak of a chilling atmosphere, as though the documents themselves still carried the weight of the sisters' suffering. The question lingers: when a life is documented so thoroughly that nothing private remains, is that life still one's own? The Morlok sisters lived not only under their father's gaze, but under the perpetual stare of science. They were measured, dissected, archived, and in the end erased. They faded into silence not because their suffering ended, but because no one was willing to look anymore. By the mid-1990s, the Morlok sisters, better known in the medical literature as the Genain Quadruplets, had almost entirely disappeared from the public eye. To the outside world, they were case histories, not people. Their names had been replaced with pseudonyms, their identities submerged beneath layers of confidentiality. Yet beneath the silence, fragments of their story remained stored in boxes, cabinets, and forgotten shelves. It was within these archives that the real ghost of the Morloks lived. The case files, buried in the National Institute of Mental Health's restricted collections, were more than 3,000 pages of notes, hundreds of photographs, and reel-to-reel recordings of therapy sessions. The earliest documents still bore Carl Morlok's handwriting. His obsessive logs of purity inspections, menstrual cycles, and coded remarks about his daughter's supposed contamination. Later volumes shifted into the detached tone of scientific description. Patient A exhibits flattened affect. Patient B demonstrates delusional ideation. What had once been the language of abuse became the language of psychiatry. The brutality did not vanish, it merely changed dialect. The photographs were perhaps the most disturbing artifacts. Lined up in clinical folders, they documented the sisters across decades, posed in identical dresses as children, slumped in hospital gowns as adults. Smiles were rare, and when they did appear, they seemed staged, as though ordered rather than chosen. In some images, the sisters clutched hands tightly, their grip almost desperate, a silent pact of survival amid surveillance. The recordings were worse. On tape, the sisters' voices carried a nervous tremor. They spoke in rehearsed scripts, their vocabulary echoing Carl's worldview even years after his death. "We must be pure," one voice said softly. Another whispered, "The Watchers will punish us." These were not the words of free women, but echoes of indoctrination, science's obsession. The persistence of these archives was no accident. For psychiatry, the sisters had represented a perfect experiment. 4 genetically identical siblings, all developing schizophrenia, yet each with different trajectories. To researchers, they were evidence, data, proof, but the pursuit of knowledge came at a terrible cost. The sisters' humanity was systematically stripped away. Each was reduced to a letter, N, G, H, or A. In articles, their individuality dissolved into pathology. Case N displayed early onset, Case G remained functional longer. It was as if the women themselves no longer existed, only their symptoms did. One psychiatrist later admitted, "We became more interested in what they represented than who they were." His confession, decades too late, underscored the violence of scientific detachment. Rumors of experiments among archivists and researchers granted restricted access. Whispers circulated of darker material, never released publicly. Some spoke of neurological interventions, electroshock sessions, experimental drug regimens, even early forms of psychosurgery. None of these claims were ever confirmed, but scattered notes hinted at something troubling. In one folder, a line appeared: Case H responded poorly to trial procedure. Minimize further exposure. No context was given, no details provided. The ambiguity was haunting. To this day, it remains unclear whether the Morlok sisters were merely observed or actively used as subjects for psychiatric experimentation. Their silence, whether voluntary, coerced, or induced, ensured that the truth stayed hidden. The final years, by the late 1990s, the sisters were elderly, though their bodies bore the wear of decades of medication and confinement. Tremors, rigid movements, brittle bones, and dulled expressions marked the toll of antipsychotic drugs. The treatment that was supposed to save them had etched itself into their flesh. Sarah, the most functional, lived with family members, but was forever cautious, wary of strangers, convinced that her history could never be escaped. Wilma maintained her rigid routines, a life circumscribed by fear of disorder. Her small apartment,
looked like a museum of rules. Edna drifted between institutions, her notebook still filled with labyrinthine visions. By then staff rarely read them, her words dismissed as mere symptoms. Helen remained mostly mute, her art sometimes surfacing, sometimes discarded. She painted until her hands failed her, leaving behind fragments of houses with no doors. They were alive yet absent, documented, yet erased. The scholars return. In the early 2000s, a new generation of scholars rediscovered the Genain case. Feminist historians of science began asking unsettling questions. What had psychiatry done to these women? Were they ever treated as persons, or only as objects of study? For the first time, the brutality of their upbringing and the failures of their medical care were examined, not as clinical curiosities, but as ethical catastrophes. The Morlok story became a cautionary tale, an indictment of both paternal tyranny and psychiatric hubris. One historian wrote, "The sisters were never seen. They were measured, but not witnessed. They were catalogued, but never known." The locked cabinets. Even now, portions of the Morlok archive remain sealed. Access requires layers of approval, and even then, much is redacted. Researchers, who have seen the closed files, speak only in careful, evasive language. Some hint at correspondence with eugenics organizations. Others allude to invasive monitoring procedures that blurred the line between treatment and violation. What exactly remains hidden is uncertain, but the very act of secrecy suggests knowledge too disturbing to confront openly. The silence around these cabinets is as chilling as Karl Morlok's locked basement, evidence of horrors concealed under the guise of protection. The aftermath. The Morlok sisters never escaped the paradox of their lives. They were both infamous and invisible, both documented and erased. Their suffering was preserved in meticulous files, yet their voices were buried beneath medical jargon. To this day, their case provokes uneasy debates. Did genetics doom them? Or did Karl's tyranny break them? Were psychiatrists healers? Or were they collaborators in another form of control? And perhaps most disturbing, did anyone ever truly see them as human? In the end, the sisters faded quietly, their deaths largely unremarked. Obituaries, when they appeared, were brief, names without context, women without stories, but the archive remained, haunting the present. The Morlok case still lingers in psychiatry like an unburied corpse. Each time the Genain Quadruplets are mentioned in a textbook or lecture, they rise again, not as women, but as symbols. Their story warns of what happens when science forgets compassion, when documentation replaces empathy, when surveillance masquerades as care. One cannot look at their files without feeling the claustrophobia of lives overexposed and yet unseen. The margins of their charts are heavy with silence, the silence of women who were spoken for, spoken about, but rarely allowed to speak. In this way, the Morlok sisters continue to haunt not only psychiatry, but the very idea of knowledge itself. They remind us that observation is never neutral, that every act of study risks becoming an act of violation.
By the dawn of the 21st century, the Morlok sisters were scattered fragments of a shattered whole. Their bodies carried the weight of decades, and their names were long forgotten outside the narrow corridors of psychiatric history. Yet in those circles their case remained alive, cited, debated, dissected. They were ghosts kept on paper, invoked in lectures, frozen in journal footnotes. But for the sisters themselves, life dwindled into silence. Sarah, the survivor, Sarah, the strongest of the four, had managed to fashion something resembling a life beyond the shadows of Bethesda. She married quietly in the 1960s, bore children in the 1970s, and by the 1990s had grandchildren, yet even her domestic stability was fragile. Visitors recalled her pacing when conversation drifted too close to the past. "We were observed," she once whispered to a cousin, and the watching never stopped. Her children grew up with an unspoken rule: never ask about their mother's girlhood. Only in old age did Sarah begin to break that silence. She gave cautious interviews, collaborated with historians, and tried to wrest the narrative away from the institutions that had consumed her youth. Her testimony became the last living voice of the Morloks, though always heavy with caution, as if unseen listeners might still punish her. Wilma, the judge's daughter, Wilma's life remained tightly bound by fear of error. She lived alone in a small apartment, its shelves lined with notebooks recording daily routines, what time she awoke, how long she brushed her teeth, the exact number of minutes she allowed herself for breakfast. Any deviation left her trembling. She rarely invited anyone in. Those who did enter described a room arranged like an exhibit, symmetrical objects, carefully placed chairs, curtains drawn against the street, a crucifix hung on one wall beneath which she muttered prayers for forgiveness each evening. For Wilma, the judges never departed, even when her father was long dead, even when the psychiatrists no longer tested her. She lived as if eyes still measured her every move. She died in the late 1990s, her obituary 2 lines long, Wilma M. Morlok, 68, of Lansing, survived by sisters. Edna, the visionary. Edna spent her later years drifting through halfway houses and care facilities, her notebooks filled with elaborate cosmologies, maps of parallel realities, diagrams of mirrored houses, lists of names she claimed were her doubles. "The world is unstable," she wrote, "and I am split across its seams." Staff usually dismissed these writings as symptomatic, but a few younger scholars who encountered them saw something more, an attempt to narrate trauma through myth, to render the unspeakable in symbolic form. To them, Edna's visions resembled Gothic allegories, haunted worlds where rooms bent out of shape and mirrors concealed strangers. She died quietly in 2004, her final notebook ending mid-sentence. "If you look away, it changes." Helen, the silent artist. Helen's path was the most tragic, institutionalized for most of her adult life. She spent decades in psychiatric wards, her identity reduced to a patient number. Yet her art, drawings, collages, fragmented poems, became the only window into her inner world. Her work depicted faceless figures, endless corridors, houses on fire. Many of her canvases showed locked doors with keyholes shaped like eyes. One series of drawings portrayed 4 identical girls holding hands in a circle, each figure gradually dissolving until only one remained. Helen rarely spoke, but when asked about her art, she muttered, "It's art." She passed away in 2011, leaving behind stacks of drawings that museums hesitated to exhibit. They were too raw, too implicated in the failures of medicine and family alike. Most remain boxed in archives, rarely see the reckoning of psychiatry. As the sisters' lives ebbed, psychiatry began to reckon with its past. The Morlok Genain case, once celebrated as a triumph of natural science, came to be criticized as a parable of exploitation. Scholars pointed out that the focus on heredity had blinded researchers to the obvious violence of Karl Morlok's reign, the father's fascist obsessions, his surveillance rituals, his abusive control. These were treated as footnotes rather than central facts. In the 1990s and 2000s, with growing awareness of trauma and abuse, the case was reinterpreted. Some argued that the sisters' schizophrenia might never have emerged, or at least not with such severity, had they been spared Karl's domination. Others insisted that genetics could not be dismissed. The debate never resolved. The sisters remained trapped in it, as if their suffering itself had become a perpetual experiment. The family curse. What haunted observers most was the sense of inevitability. The Morloks had been famous since birth, their identical faces a public spectacle. Their father saw them as proof of his racial purity, psychiatrists saw them as a natural laboratory, and the public saw them as curiosities. At no point were they simply daughters, sisters, women. The family line dissolved with them. None of the sisters' children carried forward the Morlok name. The genealogy ended, consumed by secrecy, silence and shame, yet the name persists in medical texts, a grim brand stamped onto psychiatric history. Sarah's warning. Today, Sarah is the last living witness, a nonagenarian in a quiet care facility. Visitors describe her as sharp but weary, a woman who has carried too much knowledge for too long. When asked what lesson should be drawn from her family's fate, she gives a chilling answer: never believe that watching is care. They watched us our whole life. They wrote it down, they measured it, they called it science, but no one saw us, not once. Her words echo across decades, a warning against surveillance masquerading as compassion, against knowledge pursued without empathy. The last question. The Morlok sisters' story ends not with resolution, but with unease. They were both victims of a father's tyranny, and subjects of science's hunger. Their lives force us to ask whether some wounds are inflicted not by cruelty alone, but by indifference disguised as objectivity. To read their files is to confront the abyss between data and humanity. The pages are filled with symptoms, but almost empty of recognition. One is left with the sense that the sisters did not die once but many times, as children under Karl's gaze, as patients under psychiatric scrutiny, as women erased by history, yet their story survives, unsettling, unresolved. A case that refuses closure. The archive ends abrupt. After decades of steady documentation, handwritten notes, typed evaluations, clinical graphs, the endless counting of symptoms, suddenly the trail breaks, the files thin, the entries grow sparse. One by one, the sisters vanish from the record. What remains is not a conclusion but a silence, and in that silence, question. The obituaries were as clinical as the notes that had followed them since childhood. Patient expired at 3:17 a.m. No memorials were held, no monuments raised. The Morlok sisters left behind no foundation, no family estate, no visible inheritance, only their case files and the troubled recollections of those who had watched them. The town that had once whispered about them moved on. New generations grew up unaware that in one small house, in one father's household, 4 identical girls had been broken for the sake of science. A legacy in fragments. Historians in the late 20th and early 21st century tried to reclaim their story. Articles appeared in niche journals, interviews with Sarah circulated in hushed corners of the internet, and old photographs resurfaced. Yet every retelling fractured the sisters again into data points, symbols, cautionary tales. Some cast them as victims of heredity, proof that madness ran like poison through bloodlines. Others saw them as martyrs to the dangers of authoritarian family structure. Still others reframed them as survivors, evidence of resilience against both father and institution. None of these frames fit cleanly. The sisters slipped through each one. They remained too strange, too unsettling, to be absorbed into simple categories. Sarah's last words, in her final recorded interview, conducted when she was 90, Sarah Morlok spoke haltingly. The interviewer asked whether she believed her family was cursed, whether their story was one of fate or choice. Sarah paused a long time before answering. They wanted us to be proof, she said finally, proof of whatever they already believed about blood, or sickness, or control, but we were never proof. We were just girls. Her voice broke then, and she added, and nobody ever let us. These words, trembling and almost whispered, became the closest thing to a closing statement the Morlok sisters ever gave. The collapse of the house, the Morlok home, itself, once a site of local fascination, fell into disrepair after Carl's death. By the 1980s, the roof sagged, the paint peeled, the garden was choked with weeds. Teenagers dared each other to enter, reporting strange drafts, the echo of footsteps upstairs, windows that rattled though no wind blew. In 1992 the house was demolished, its lot paved over for a small municipal building, but residents swore the air around it never felt right. Some avoided walking past at night, others muttered that the ground itself was tainted, that no construction could settle properly. An archivist later remarked, the home vanished, but the watching never did. The whisper in the records. Even now when one reads the surviving files, an uncanny feeling creeps in. The notes are cold, factual, but in their repetition something else seeps through. The endless observation, the constant recording, the refusal to look away. It is as if the paper itself became haunted. One cannot escape the sense that by reading, one continues the cycle, that the watcher's gaze, passed from father to psychiatrist to historian, now passes into the reader. It leaves a troubling question. Is the story kept alive to honor the sisters, or to continue the experiment? The unfinished case. The Morlok family name ends here. No descendants carry it forward. Yet the case persists in textbooks and databases, in whispered online threads, in medical lectures, where the quadruplets are reduced again to charts and slides. Their story has no neat resolution, because it was never allowed to belong to. It belonged to their father's tyranny, to psychiatry's ambitions, to history's curiosity. The sisters' lives were consumed, not lived, and in that consumption lies the true horror, not madness, not heredity, but erasure, a disturbing echo, and still something lingers. In some psychiatric wards, staff mention patients who draw circles of 4 figures in their notebooks, without knowing why. In certain research archives, graduate students describe an oppressive silence when handling the Morlok files, as if unseen eyes measured their reading speed. Even today, local residents in Bethesda, Maryland speak of 4 identical shapes, glimpsed in mirrors after midnight. They are always together, always watching. Science may dismiss such stories as superstition, but the legend of the Morlok sisters has slipped beyond science. It belongs now to folklore, to fear, to the uneasy places where history and haunting intertwine, lingering dread. Perhaps this is the truest inheritance of the Morlok sisters, not their genes, not their diagnoses, but the unease that clings to anyone who hears their story.
They remind us that human beings are not specimens, that watching can wound, that silence can destroy, and if you find yourself thinking of them tonight, 4 girls, 1 father, endless eyes, remember this: some observers never leave, some gazes outlast death, and sometimes when you feel watched for no reason, it is not your imagination.